Hi, everyone, and welcome to the course of World History. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at American imperialism as our main topic. Our essential question today is how and why did the United States participate in imperialism? And to answer this question, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning with the United States, because as soon as European colonists arrived in North America, they began to assert their rights to land that was held by others. Imperialism was here with the birth of the United States before we even were the United States. See, from the very start, America was an imperial nation. Imperialism is this idea that you can go into another person's land and impose your systems upon other people. Well, that is what colonization was in North America. It was these Europeans coming over and taking over others' land. And we continued to push westward. Now, once independent, Americans accelerated this process. We went into overdrive with it, pushing as far west as we possibly could. Our European colonizing powers didn't have as much interest in Western empire. They wanted to stay focused on the Atlantic and what the colonies could do in terms of providing goods for Europe. Americans, once separate of Europe, wanted to look westward. And this resulted in a nearly endless series of wars against Native Americans until there was no Native American resistance left. So the United States came to believe in this principle they called manifest destiny. That's what they used to justify some of this. This was their belief that God wanted Americans to conquer because American conquest meant the spread of democracy and capitalism. And if democracy and capitalism are good, and the United States is spreading democracy and capitalism, then what we are doing must be willed by God. And we use this throughout the 1800s to justify what we're doing in terms of the conquest of native lands and the seizure of Mexican lands as well through the Mexican-American War. And using manifest destiny, this image of American settlers chasing the natives west and bringing in technology and industry behind them is what led to the conquest of North America. Imperialism, though, expands beyond continental North America. Early in American history, President James Monroe had issued something called the Monroe Doctrine back in the 1820s. Now, the idea of the Monroe Doctrine was that the United States was saying that we were going to intervene and stop Europe from trying to be an imperial power in the Western Hemisphere. That we weren't going to allow France and Germany and whomever to come over and try to conquer lands in the West. That we were the protectors of the West. So this was the idea behind the Monroe Doctrine. Now, in the 1820s, the United States was not powerful enough to actually enforce this. But it was an idea in principle. Europe was busy with its own mess at the time. This wasn't a big colonizing time for them. Britain kind of had our back on it because they weren't interested in the Western Hemisphere anymore. So this policy was able to stand. But of course, it does lead to just one major power in the Western Hemisphere, and that's the United States. And so our protection of Latin America becomes something of a protection racket. We wind up engaged quite a bit in economic imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. Not as much territorial, but a lot of economic imperialism. What this means is that American businessmen would go into all these Latin American countries with, American money. Our economy was strong, doing well. A lot of these countries had just fought their wars for independence in the 1820s and were struggling through those early years. And Americans took advantage of this to buy up large swaths of land and would control Latin American industries, sugar, bananas, and so on and so forth. Now, these businesses would exploit local labor for profit. Once you are the biggest employer in an area, you can give low wages and not really use any of your profits to invest in local development. You don't put in a whole bunch of railroads other than the ones that you need. You don't build schools. You don't help with government buildings. You don't do any of this stuff. You take your profits with you back to America. And this is what the United States was doing in Latin America for a long time. Now, did Latin American nations like this? No. Did their governments occasionally try to stop Americans from doing it? Yes. But when they did, the United States would simply send in their military, and at first it would just be a threat. You just show up with a whole bunch of warships and you say, hey, Panama, I really think that you should stop what you're doing. And Panama might stop what they're doing, but if they don't, well, you use those weapons and you overthrow their government and you put in place a government that will support U.S. business coming in and making a lot of money in Latin America. And the United States did this. They did this for quite some time and built a lot of resentment in Latin America for doing so. Some of this resentment is still felt to this day, where Latin America blames the United States for the installation of dictators and for stunting the growth of their natural economies by participating in economic imperialism throughout throughout all of Latin America. This does include a couple of dozen invasions of the United States into Latin American nations. Outside of Latin America, we were doing a similar thing on the islands of Hawaii. American businessmen were going in and purchasing land, putting in sugar plantations and whatnot. But the Hawaiian monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, did not like what she was seeing with this and tried to stand up to the growing power of those American businessmen, those planters. When she did so, a detachment of American Marines, without orders from our central government, think about the distance between Hawaii and Washington, D.C., and the times we're talking about. Communication was not good. This group of U.S. Marines took it upon themselves to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and depose the Hawaiian government, and to allow the planters to set up their own system. When President Cleveland finds out about this, the American president at the time, he orders an investigation. And this investigation finds that this was definitely illegal. The U.S. Marines should not have done this. They did not have the justification to go in and overthrow the ruling monarch of a foreign country, of which the United States had a good relationship. The U.S. and Hawaii had multiple treaties of friendship with each other. But a couple years later, Cleveland is defeated in an election. We wind up with President McKinley, who is quite an imperialist, and overturns Cleveland's decision, annexes Hawaii, and Hawaii becomes a part of the United States. Talking about McKinley the imperialist, McKinley was going to further expand America's overseas imperial empire during the Spanish-American War of 1890, something that was called a splendid little war. America really stood up and became a world power starting at this time. During this war, the United States captures Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines from Spain, 4 territories, of which the United States becomes kind of an imperial overlord. A little bit less so in Cuba. Cuba's granted independence shortly after this, but there's an amendment slid into their constitution, the Platt Amendment, in which they agree to allow the United States to come in and intervene in Cuban affairs whenever the United States feels the need to. And of course, with this independence comes American businessmen buying Cuban land, establishing American businesses there, and the system of exploitation continues. The U.S. does similar things in Guam and Puerto Rico as overseas possessions, and to this day, 2022, the United States continues to hold both Guam and Puerto Rico as overseas possessions. The Philippines. The Philippines is a whole other story. The Philippines stands as the clearest, most overt act of American overseas imperialism. In the Philippines, we were an imperialist power in every way. It starts when the U.S. captures the islands from Spain. Filipinos at that time had already been fighting a war for independence against Spain, and they're very happy to see the American fleet sail into Manila Bay and crush the Spanish fleet. Hooray! The Americans are here to help us. No. The Americans were there to replace the Spanish, not to free the Philippines from Spain. Now, the Philippines, after the Spanish are gone, do declare themselves independent, and they do set up a government, the First Philippine Republic. But when America refuses to leave the Philippines, they do declare war on these American occupiers who are asserting their right to rule the Philippines. This war lasts about 3.5 years. It results in, this is a low estimate, 200,000 civilian deaths. Estimates do go as high as 1 million. That is probably high. And the Filipinos do lose this war. That results in the United States continuing to hold the Philippines as an imperial possession, an overseas possession, all the way until after World War II, where the U.S. Acknowledges Philippine independence. Now, the reason why the United States had wanted to hold the Philippines was as an important stepping stone to Chinese markets. There was an economic desire there and a desire to sell American goods in China, which was a big motivating factor for the United States. That's all that I've got for you today. I hope that you learned something, and farewell.